Lie back, take a slow breath, and let your mind travel backwards through time. The room around you fades, the hum of modern life recedes, and you step through a threshold into the spring of year 536 CE. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are now? Let that thought drift as you begin to walk through a world that will ask everything of you. In early 536, something unusual stirred in the sky. Across much of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, the sun behaved strangely. It gave forth light, but without its usual brilliance. The great historian of Byzantium, Procopius, observed that, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, and that men were free neither from war nor pestilence, nor from any other thing leading to death. The days remained pale, the seasons unsteady, and for ordinary people, the familiar signposts of life began to wobble." Behind that fading sun lay a force far beyond human control. Researchers now identify a massive volcanic eruption, probably in Iceland, that lofted enormous amounts of ash and sulfate into the atmosphere, dimming sunlight and plunging temperatures downward. Tree rings tightened, ice cores recorded sulfate spikes, and modern science began to reveal what ancient witnesses had sensed: a global climate shock without precedent. The sunlight that once warmed fields and hearths simply faltered. Summer came, but summer did not behave as expected. In distant Ireland, the annals recorded a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In Asia, travelers spoke of snow in highlands during warm months. Crops that sustained families failed. Vineyards yielded sour wine. Harvest rituals turned into dread. Food, once routine, became scarce. Hunger whispered its presence in hearths, and work became gamble rather than guarantee. Cold and dark worked together to unravel economies. Trade routes slowed. Labor faltered. Grain that once paid rent now sold for hours of toil. One historian argues that this year marked the start of a period now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a decades-long chill that shifted the very foundation of societies across Europe and Western Asia. What was once a rhythm of seasons became a struggle. In homes that once promised comfort, insecurity settled in families. The world outside the sun, the rain, the fields felt less reliable. Fear crept, not as a roaring monster, but as a constant murmur, a low companion as dusk lingered and mornings froze deeper than usual. As the cold held on, roofs sagged under snow that should never have fallen. Animals perished in barns. Children woke to hunger instead of dawn's promise. The guardians of hearth and harvest found themselves watching failure instead of plenty. And in that failure lay another tragedy. When hunger deepens, illness finds its way. In 541, the plague of Justinian broke out, an epidemic that struck an empire already weakened by famine and cold. Bodies piled in streets, labor vanished, cities stuttered. The very institutions which once held power now found themselves bending beneath the weight of catastrophe. History remembers it as a major turning point, but for those alive then, it felt like the world was unraveling. Darkness, cold, hunger, disease. One after another, they arrived, not as separate events, but as a chain. The year 536 didn't just hurt, it shook the foundations of existence. It challenged the simplest faiths, that sunlight would return, that crops would grow, that life could go on. For many, each sunrise felt borrowed. So now, as you lie still in the comfort of your modern room, reflect on the pale sun of 536 CE. Reflect on the farmers who planted nothing, on the children who ate little, on the people who watched the sky dim and still hoped. History's worst year to be alive is not just a fact, it is a story of endurance, of survival when everything goes wrong. As months passed, the haze in the sky refused to lift. The world seemed caught beneath a vast, thin shroud, a gray veil that softened light but hardened life. Travelers described the sun as if viewed through smoked glass. At noon, it glowed, dim and coppery. At dusk, it turned to a pale circle, more ghost than star. Birds flew in uncertain patterns, livestock grew restless, and farmers waited for warmth that never came. Across the Byzantine Empire, imperial scribes recorded strange weather and strange omens. The Nile flooded irregularly, confusing the cycles of planting and harvest. In Constantinople, markets filled with anxious whispers. Why was the sun hiding? Was it the anger of God, or the omen of something vast and divine? Even scholars, men of books and philosophy, could only observe and worry. Few dared claim to understand it. In the countryside, however, no one had time for cosmic speculation. Life was brutally simple. Seed the fields, harvest the grain, survive the winter. But when the sun failed to shine properly, seeds refused to sprout. The growing season shrank. Crops withered before ripening. Whole regions faced lean months. Villages that had known mild hunger before now stared into famine. In Ireland, chroniclers would later write that a failure of bread persisted for years. The words sound simple, almost dull, but in those plain syllables lie nights of gnawing hunger, the slow wasting of the old and the very young, and the long, hollow silence of fields that should have rustled with life. Famine was not only the absence of food, it was the absence of order. People began to barter precious heirlooms for a handful of meal. Bakers were guarded by desperate crowds. Soldiers deserted to find food for their families. Small crimes, born of hunger, multiplied. Villages learned that the thin line between peace and chaos was simply bread. Further east, the great Sassanid Empire of Persia was no better off. Dust dimmed the skies of Mesopotamia. Rivers ran low. Pastures turned brown. The empire's horses, symbols of nobility and strength, died in droves. Caravan trade faltered. Even the Silk Road slowed, its lifeblood of goods and gossip stifled by climate collapse. And to the north, in the cold forests of Scandinavia, archaeologists have found layers of pollen and ash, showing that 536 was a year when meadows stopped flowering, and the trees themselves paused their growth. Hunters and farmers abandoned old settlements. Some scholars believe entire communities vanished into migration or extinction. What no one could see was the chain reaction unfolding above them. The great volcanic eruption, likely from Iceland or somewhere within the northern hemisphere, had hurled ash particles high into the stratosphere. These fine aerosols reflected sunlight, cooling the Earth's surface. Modern scientists, analyzing ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, have found evidence of two massive eruptions, one around 536, and another only a few years later, around 540. The world already dimmed was dealt a second blow before it could recover from the first. It was as if nature itself had forgotten the rhythm of time. Winters deepened unnaturally. Snow fell where it never had before. Summers became cold and wet, filled with unending rain and mist. Frosts struck in early autumn. Rivers froze longer than memory could recall. Even bees, those quiet custodians of harvest, disappeared from their hives. In China, chroniclers of the Northern Wei dynasty recorded yellow dust rain that fell from the sky and widespread famine that destroyed entire provinces. In the Americas, ice core data and archaeological evidence suggest similar disruptions. This was not a local disaster, it was global, a darkening of the entire Earth. And yet, life persisted, as it always does, stubbornly, awkwardly, painfully. Some people adapted. Fishermen leaned more heavily on the sea, though even the ocean's rhythms had changed. Hunters returned to forests. Monks in remote monasteries began to record strange weather and celestial events in illuminated margins. Believing these signs were divine messages, the medieval imagination filled the void of knowledge with theology. Perhaps this was the beginning of the apocalypse. For the elite, the disaster became philosophical. In Constantinople, courtiers whispered that Emperor Justinian's wars had angered heaven. In Rome, priests held longer masses. In Alexandria, astrologers scoured the skies for planetary misalignment. The old pagan notion of cosmic balance resurfaced, that human pride might have disturbed the natural order. For ordinary people, however, apocalypse was less abstract. It was hunger, it was sickness, it was silence in the fields where birds no longer sang. By the end of 537, the darkness had lasted for over a year. Even the most skeptical now began to despair. The crops failed again. Livestock starved. Starving mothers boiled bark and moss into thin soup. Children died before the thaw. Travelers wrote of whole villages abandoned, the dead left unburied because the living lacked strength to dig. In Scandinavia, archaeologists have found mass sacrifices from this period, valuables thrown into lakes, weapons bent and buried, offerings to gods who might restore the light. The Old Norse pantheon was being begged for mercy. The rituals tell us what words could not. The people felt that the world itself had been wounded. Slowly, faintly, the haze began to clear. The sun returned, pale at first, then brighter. But the damage had been done. The 530s left deep scars in soil and soul alike. Even when the sky cleared, famine lingered. Population declined. Empires faltered. The Romans never truly recovered. Their economy, already strained, began to splinter. The Byzantine campaigns slowed. Trade routes shifted. And then came the final blow. As if nature had not yet done enough, in 541 CE, ships from Egypt brought something even more terrible than darkness, a plague that would sweep through the Mediterranean and kill millions. The world, weakened by cold and hunger, was defenseless. The plague of Justinian began its grim work, turning a climate disaster into a civilizational one. But that, perhaps, is a story for another section. Because the year 536 was only the beginning, the prelude to a world reshaped by catastrophe. Imagine now the dim sky over Europe, the ash still drifting unseen, and the fragile human figures beneath it carrying on, harvesting, mourning, hoping. That is the real weight of history's worst year. Not merely its suffering, but its endurance. The strange twilight of 536 lingered long enough that people began to forget what true daylight looked like. Children born that year would grow to their first steps beneath a pale sun. To them, that dim orange glow, neither night nor day, was simply the way the world had always been. The elders spoke of brighter skies, as though recalling a half-remembered dream. The natural order had unraveled, not with sudden explosions or fiery omens, but in slow suffocation. It was this slowness that made it so cruel. Each season brought the faint hope that the light might return, and each season betrayed that hope. In the Mediterranean, merchants who had once sailed briskly between ports found the wind patterns changed. Weather grew unpredictable. Storms appeared where calm waters had always been. Ships went missing more often, and the price of grain rose steeply. In Constantinople, even the rich began to feel the pinch. Gold could no longer guarantee fresh bread or imported figs. Markets smelled of dried fish and desperation. From the northern reaches of Gaul to the coasts of Iberia, food riots occasionally flared. Local lords hoarded supplies, and monasteries, once symbols of peace, became fortresses of grain. Peasants would travel for days seeking monasteries known to feed the hungry, only to find the gates closed, not out of cruelty, but because even monks were starving. The misery of the time seeps through the writings of Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman serving the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. He described the sun as losing its light, appearing blue and feeble as if in eclipse. His words, now over a millennium old, still carry the confusion and quiet dread of someone witnessing the impossible. Even the wise and learned men, surrounded by books and candles, had no explanation beyond divine wrath or celestial misfortune. In the East, where the great Persian Empire ruled vast lands from Mesopotamia to the Indus, the same despair echoed. Zoroastrian priests interpreted the darkened skies as a cosmic struggle, the shadow of Ahriman, spirit of evil, waging war against Ahura Mazda, the light. Ritual fires burned brighter than ever, desperate acts to restore cosmic order. Yet beneath the religious interpretations, ordinary people did what they always had. They adapted. Human beings are, after all, creatures of persistence. When wheat failed, they foraged wild barley. When sheep died, they ate roots and bark. Some learned to dry seaweed and grind it into flour. It was a time when ingenuity was survival. In Britain, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of mass abandonment, villages left empty, pottery shards in hearths where fires went out. The island, already isolated from the Roman world, slipped further into what historians call the darkest part of the Dark Ages. Trade collapsed, roads decayed, Roman villas became ruins, claimed by moss and silence. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, tree rings show an almost complete halt in growth between 536 and 540. Imagine that. Forests so weakened by cold and low sunlight that even ancient pines ceased their yearly expansion. For the Norse tribes, this was an omen of Ragnarok, the death of the world foretold in myth. And in a way, for them, it was. Livestock perished, and families fled south. The survivors carried tales of endless winter that would, centuries later, echo in the sagas. In the great halls of learning, such as Alexandria and Antioch, Scholars debated possible causes. Some blamed comets, others a veil of dust from celestial collisions. No one imagined that a distant volcano could cast a shadow upon empires. For those who recorded history then, the event was cosmic, beyond natural explanation. But there is another kind of record, one that doesn't rely on parchment or ink. The Earth itself. Deep within the Greenland ice, frozen layers preserve the invisible fingerprints of that catastrophe: sulfur, volcanic glass, and ash particles carried by the upper winds. Modern analysis has traced these two massive eruptions, possibly in Iceland or Central America. To think that molten stone from a mountain thousands of miles away could dim the sun across continents, it almost sounds mythic. Yet science confirms what those ancient witnesses saw. The misery of the 530s reshaped societies quietly. Crop failures meant fewer taxes. Fewer taxes meant weaker armies. Armies that could not be paid turned to looting. Once stable provinces became restless. Borders blurred. In the West, remnants of Rome faded faster. In the East, Justinian's dream of restoring imperial glory faced the harsh reality of an exhausted world. And still, nature was not done. The cooling continued into the 540s. Famine persisted in some regions for nearly a decade. Populations fell drastically. Forests regrew where farms once lay. Europe, Asia, and Africa, 3 continents, all bent under the same invisible weight. It's almost hard to imagine, from our modern comfort, to live through a decade when summer felt like late autumn, when dawns came late and evenings came early, when even the birds seemed confused by the muted sky. Yet that was the daily reality for millions. Think of a candlelit hut in Ireland, smoke curling up from a peat fire, a mother whispering to her child that the sun will come back soon. Or a scribe in Constantinople scratching a note into wax tablets, trying to make sense of what he calls a year without warmth. Those moments, lost and forgotten, are the real heartbeat of 536. And through all of this, hunger, cold, confusion, humanity still dreamed. In the monasteries, monks continued to copy manuscripts. In Persia, poets still wrote laments. In China, astronomers still recorded eclipses. Civilization trembled, but did not collapse. The world dimmed, but minds kept flickering with stubborn light. Some centuries later, people would look back and not even know what to call it: a catastrophe, an omen, a curse, or simply the year the sun forgot to shine. But in truth, the story of 536 is not about a single year. It's about endurance, the quiet, uncelebrated ability of humans to survive even when the world itself seems to turn against them. And it leaves us with an unsettling question. If such a thing happened again, a sky darkened by ash, a decade of cold, would we endure it as they did? Across the continents, the year 536 unfolded like a slow sigh of the earth, a long, trembling pause between what had been and what was to come. The great cities that once glittered with marble and sunlight were now bathed in a constant haze. Dust hung in the air like ghostly mist, softening the edges of temples and towers, turning the world into a painting done entirely in ash. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian sat in his palace overlooking the Bosporus, unaware that his golden dreams were being shadowed by forces beyond any human command. He was a ruler of ambition, determined to restore the lost glory of Rome, to reconquer the West, to build monuments that would outlast time. But outside the gleaming walls of Constantinople, the empire's lands were dim and weary. Crops failed, rivers ran low, and the citizens whispered that perhaps the heavens themselves had turned against the emperor's pride. In the fields beyond the city walls, the farmers noticed strange patterns. The wheat heads were smaller, the barley thin and brittle. They prayed to the saints, to the old gods, to anyone who might bring warmth back to the soil. The ground had grown colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit, a fatigue that settled into the bones of the land. Letters from merchants tell us of the confusion of trade. The caravans moving through the Levant, which once carried spices, ivory, and silk, now returned empty. The routes through Persia and India became perilous, not from bandits, but from hunger itself. Villages that had once welcomed travelers now offered nothing but silence. Inns stood empty, their hearths cold. In the far north, the dim light brought disorientation. Norse fishermen spoke of the sea losing its color. The waves reflected not the sky's blue, but a dull iron gray, endless and heavy. Nets came up lighter than usual. Even the fish seemed to vanish from the cold shallows. The people gathered in longhouses and recited old tales of Fimbulwinter, the endless winter that would herald the world's end. For many, prophecy no longer felt like myth. It felt like news. Meanwhile, in China, the dynastic scribes recorded a yellow dust that fell like rain, dimming the sun and staining the rivers. The chronicles of the Northern Wei and Southern dynasties spoke of frost in midsummer and failed harvests. Grain prices rose to unbearable levels, and desperate families sold their land, even their children, for food. To later generations, these entries in ancient scrolls might seem like exaggeration, but the truth was far crueler. The earth itself had lost its rhythm. Animals, too, suffered in silence. Sheep miscarried. Oxen grew weak from lack of fodder. Birds changed their migrations, appearing in places they had never been before. As though confused by the dim compass of the sun, the natural world seemed adrift, and humanity, so dependent upon its steady cycles, felt the tremor of that uncertainty in their very hearts. And yet, the darkness brought something else, an eerie beauty. At night, the skies glowed faintly red, a phenomenon caused by the volcanic dust that scattered light across the upper atmosphere. For those who dared to look up, the heavens looked like burning silk. Some called it divine warning, others thought it the breath of angels. But whatever they believed, no one forgot the sight of those silent, blood-colored nights. By late 537, the social fabric began to tear. Famine was no longer a whisper, it was a cry. Entire families left their homes in search of food, only to perish on the road. In Italy, the Gothic wars had already ravaged the land, and now the darkness finished what war had begun. Chronicles from monasteries speak of towns where dogs feasted upon the bodies of the unburied. The monks recorded such details not to shock, but to preserve, to ensure that, if humanity survived, it would remember how fragile life could be. Yet even in those desperate years, there were acts of quiet grace. In the abbeys of Ireland, monks sheltered the starving and copied manuscripts by dim candlelight, their ink freezing on the parchment. In the deserts of Egypt, Hermits prayed for the world, their faces illuminated by a sun they could barely see. And in Constantinople, Justinian's architects continued to build the great Hagia Sophia, its domes rising through the dust, a defiant gesture of faith against despair. It was as if humanity refused to let the darkness have the final word. Science would one day explain what they could not, that sometime around early 536, a massive volcanic eruption had blasted millions of tons of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere. The debris spread across the globe, forming a veil that dimmed sunlight and dropped global temperatures. The ice core of Greenland and Antarctica, like frozen archives, still hold those particles, tiny memorials to the most miserable year in human memory. But for the people who lived through it, there was no scientific explanation. There was only the slow unfolding of dread, the frost that wouldn't melt, the dim skies that lingered for 18 months, the hollow faces of neighbors who stopped coming to the market. For them, 536 wasn't a number, it was a season of the soul. And yet, beneath that long twilight, history was shifting. The fields that failed would alter trade routes. The hunger that spread would move armies. The silence that followed would echo into the great changes of the next century, the rise of new faiths, the fall of empires, and the arrival of something even darker, the plague. Before that story begins, the world would first have to survive this one, the quiet apocalypse of 536. As the dim skies lingered, people began to lose their sense of time itself. Mornings bled into evenings, and evenings felt like a second dawn that never brightened. The rhythm of the sun, the ancient clock by which every farmer, sailor, and shepherd had lived, had been broken. Candles and oil lamps burned at all hours, yet their weak flames offered little warmth. Smoke gathered inside cottages and palaces alike, clinging to rafters and throats. In villages scattered across Europe, time was measured not by light but by hunger. Parents learned to stretch crumbs into meals, boiling roots and bark into thin soup. The elderly gave up their portions for the young, whispering that the Lord would soon send deliverance. Yet, week after week, the dim gray dawn returned unchanged, and the people, Christian, pagan, and everything in between, began to ask the same question. Had the world itself sinned? Priests stood before their congregations in half-empty churches, reading from psalms about wrath and mercy, their voices trembling with uncertainty. In Rome, where the ruins of the ancient empire still stood like ghosts of marble, people looked upon the broken statues of Jupiter and Mars and wondered whether the old gods were reclaiming their power. They lit candles at their bases once more, just in case. In Pharaoh, Persia, the royal court debated omens. Zoroastrian priests recorded that the light of the sun was dim as though through smoke. Fires in the sacred temples burned dull and low, refusing to blaze as they once did. To a civilization that worshipped fire as the symbol of creation and purity, this was not merely unsettling, it was terrifying. It was as though the divine flame itself was faltering. In the highlands of Scotland, the people of the Picts painted their bodies with blue woad and held night-long vigils on the hills, beating drums to call upon their ancestors. In Icelandic sagas, written centuries later, echoes of this strange time would appear as whispers of 3 winters with no summer. Whether these tales were memory or myth, no one could say, but the stories carried the truth of despair that once blanketed the north. The Mediterranean, once glittering with trade ships, grew eerily quiet. In the ports of Alexandria and Carthage, ships sat motionless, their sails furled. The sea itself appeared darker, as though reflecting the mood of the heavens. Merchants who once argued over the price of spices now spoke instead of omens. And as hunger spread, people turned inward, suspicious of strangers and fearful of contagion that had not yet come. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian tried to maintain order through decrees and charity. Bread was distributed from the imperial granaries, but supplies dwindled faster than they could be replenished. The emperor's advisors warned that the countryside could no longer support the capital, even as the grand basilicas of the city stood gleaming, their mosaics glittering faintly in the dim light. The mood among the people turned bleak. Rumors swirled that the emperor's building of the Hagia Sophia, that massive dome rising toward the heavens, had offended God. By the winter of 537, the silence became unbearable. Chroniclers tell us of a cold unlike any other, a frost that crept beneath doors and into the marrow of men. Fires burned constantly, yet walls still wept with moisture. The sun, when it appeared at all, looked like a pale disk of silver, something distant, fragile, and alien. And in that silence, faith began to waver. People, once sure of divine order, began to dream of endings. In monasteries, scribes added marginal notes to their manuscripts. The sun is dim, the fields are barren, the people despair. These small, trembling lines, preserved on parchment, are among the most honest words ever written in human history. They were not meant as prophecy or history. They were simple witnesses of suffering. Somewhere in northern Gaul, a farmer's wife buried her youngest child. The ground was so frozen she could not dig deep, so she covered the body with stones and whispered prayers she barely believed. To her, this was not the fall of empires or the wrath of heaven. It was the quiet tragedy of existence. Across continents, countless others performed the same ritual, unseen and unrecorded. And yet, in the midst of grief, humanity endured. Monks in Ireland continued to copy ancient texts, preserving fragments of Greek philosophy and Roman science. In Ethiopia, traders carried on their roots through Axum, their faith unbroken. In distant Japan, the chronicle known as the Nihon Shoki would later note a mysterious dimming of the sun, proof that even the farthest reaches of the world had felt the breath of 536. The most astonishing truth of that year was not how people suffered, but how they adapted. They learned to fish in colder waters, to forage for what little the forest offered. They built hearths closer to their beds and shared homes with animals for warmth. Communities shrank but grew tighter. The human will, quiet, stubborn, and ancient, refused to surrender. Still, no one could imagine that this was only the beginning. The sky would remain dim for nearly 2 years, and even after the sun returned, the scars it left would never truly fade. The earth had entered a colder age. Crops failed again in 539 and 540. The ice thickened. And when warmth finally began to return, something else came with it, a new terror. Born in the damp corners of the Byzantine Empire, the plague of Justinian. But before the plague came, before the wars and the famines to follow, there was simply the waiting, the long, breathless, waiting for light. Some chroniclers would later write that 536 was the year when the sun gave no shadow. A poetic exaggeration, perhaps, but to those who lived it, it felt utterly true. The light that had once governed their lives had turned into a ghost, and in that ghostly glow, the world realized for the first time in centuries just how fragile civilization truly was. The years following 536 felt like moving through a half-remembered dream. The light returned, but it came slowly, and shadows clung to everything. Farms that had collapsed did not revive. The surplus that once supported cities vanished. In the Mediterranean world, the great granaries of Rome and Constantinople creaked under strain. What followed was not only the cold, it was the unraveling of institutions built for grandeur, trade, and empire. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Emperor Justinian I continued his ambitious campaigns, reconquering parts of Italy, rebuilding cities, constructing the great domed church of Hagia Sophia. But behind the marble and mosaics lay an empire wounded by climate and hunger. Tax revenues dropped. Soldiers went unpaid. Armies grew restless. The sheen of imperial power dulled under the weight of failing crops and empty granaries. Meanwhile, the Veil of Dust event from 536 had awakened something in the world's ecology. New research shows that summer temperatures in 536 and the following years fell by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. In Europe, one of the largest short-term declines recorded. These colder, darker years provided fertile terrain for disaster. A weakened population, malnourished and cold, stood ready to be struck. In 541 CE, the first major wave of the plague of Justinian emerged. The pandemic of bubonic plague arrived in the empire's granary region and spread along trading routes into the heart of Constantinople and beyond. Works buried in quicklime, mass graves, abandoned towns, all spoke of a society stretched thin. Historians estimate the outbreak significantly weakened the empire's economy and infrastructure. For the ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, traders, the plague arrived not as distant news, but as a tangible collapse. Flocks failed. Shop doors closed. Fear replaced certainty. In many towns, bodies were left unburied for days because the living had no strength to dig. In the capital, records show that at its height, up to 10,000 people a day may have died. In the far north, where the darkness had already chilled fields, migrations began. Scandinavian settlers moved south. Rural villages collapsed. Scholars studying tree ring data observe that forests entered periods of stagnation, suggesting the human burden of survival extended beyond famine into ecosystem breakdown. Trade networks, the lifeblood of empire, withered. The Silk Road's caravans dwindled. The Mediterranean's merchant fleets grew wary. Grain ships left fewer ports. Cities that once thrived on commerce now relied on charity. In Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, grain shipments fell. Fields that had required workers no longer did. Labor shortages drove wages up, but food remained unaffordable for many. As social order faltered, religious institutions stepped in. Churches and monasteries offered what little they could: food, refuge, prayer. The shift began subtly. Where once the emperor and the state had fed the people, now the church did. In some regions, this marked a turning point toward the medieval world. a society where local lords and the church became the stabilizing power, rather than distant emperors. By the late 540s, the world was changing. The liturgy in Constantinople echoed prayers for deliverance. Across Europe, farmers sowed less land each spring. Fields reverted to pasture or forest. Towns shrank. Where once the sound of hammer striking anvil might have filled the air, now silence hung heavy. The darkness of 536 hadn't ended, had simply reshaped everything. As you lie still now, think of the pale sky of 536, not lifting fully, but fading slowly, like a candle guttering in draught. Imagine the grain stores gone empty, the trade ships silent. Imagine the people enduring year after year, not sure if spring would come. And ask yourself, when light leaves, what holds you up? The world that emerged from 536 was not merely darker, it was older, slower, and infinitely more cautious. Across the once vibrant cities of the Eastern Roman Empire, people began to think differently about the world around them. The trust they once had in seasons, in sunlight, in the simple order of days and nights, had been quietly broken. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew that the world could betray you, that the sun could vanish, and nothing could bring it back. In Constantinople, the capital of the empire, life returned in fragments. The plague still stalked the narrow alleys. The sweet, sick smell of decay mingled with incense from the churches. The city's docks stood half empty. Ships still arrived from Alexandria and Carthage, but their holds carried fewer amphorae of grain and more whispers of illness. The once glittering capital that Justinian dreamed would rival ancient Rome had become a fortress of survival. The emperor himself, worn and cautious, retreated more frequently into the walls of the great palace, surrounded by priests and physicians who burned incense and herbs to purify the air. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that faith began to replace reason as the anchor of survival. Priests declared that the darkness and the plague were divine punishment. Crowds filled the Hagia Sophia, not in celebration, but in repentance. They sang in candlelight, smoke curling upward into the dim dome as if to find a sky that was no longer visible. Outside, families pressed coins into the hands of beggars, hoping generosity might appease a watching God. But it wasn't only religion that changed. The rhythm of daily life itself was altered. The empire's administrative machine, famed for its precision, began to fail. Couriers took longer to arrive. Taxes went uncollected in rural provinces. Where once the empire had prided itself on paved roads and efficient trade, now those same roads carried funerals, refugees, and monks bearing relics. In the countryside, the crisis took on a quieter, harsher form. The volcanic veil that had first covered the sun in 536 had disrupted rainfall patterns for years. The Nile's floods became erratic. The crops of Egypt, the empire's lifeline, withered. Papyrus records found near Oxyrhynchus reveal grain prices tripling in some years, pushing countless peasants into starvation. And when the plague finally reached these provinces, the population losses were devastating. Historians now believe that this period marked a fundamental economic break, a point where the ancient world, built on trade, slavery, and imperial grandeur, gave way to the local, fragile economies that would define medieval Europe. In Italy, Fields once owned by senators became wastelands. In Gaul, aristocrats retreated into their fortified villas, sealing themselves off from the chaos outside. The network of long-distance trade that had carried silk from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa began to disintegrate. For the average person, the change was deeply personal. A peasant in northern Gaul or Britain would have noticed it in the silence of empty roads, in the church bells tolling more often, in the arrival of strangers seeking shelter from famine. The memory of the darkened skies lingered, a half-spoken trauma passed down through generations. Even when the sun finally shone bright again, some people still refused to plant crops too early, fearing another betrayal of the seasons. In Scandinavia, the echoes of 536 carved themselves into legend. Norse myths tell of Fimbulvetr, the great winter before Ragnarok, the end of the world. 3 winters without summer, a darkness that devours the earth. Archaeologists now link these stories to the real climate catastrophe that began in 536. Tree ring data from Sweden and Finland show years of halted growth, followed by signs of desperate human adaptation, settlements abandoned, animal bones showing signs of starvation, tools buried and never reclaimed. Far to the east, in China, chroniclers recorded a yellow dust that dimmed the sun, summer frosts that destroyed crops, and widespread famine. From the Northern Wei to the Sui dynasty, the empire faced political collapse, rebellions, and migration. Across the globe, civilizations that had no contact with one another suffered in eerie synchrony, as if the planet itself had turned hostile. Yet, amid all this suffering, there was resilience. People adjusted to survive in ways that today might seem mundane, but were acts of quiet brilliance. Farmers experimented with barley instead of wheat because it ripened earlier in the cold. Villagers began preserving food through salting and fermenting more aggressively, anticipating future shortages. Families stored dried beans in clay pots and buried them in the ground to keep them safe from thieves or rats. These small acts, these forgotten innovations, were the real reason humanity endured 536. Even the plague, for all its horror, had strange consequences. The massive depopulation led to a redistribution of land and labor. Wages rose, at least temporarily. Some former slaves gained freedom when their masters died without heirs. Abandoned estates became opportunities for the surviving poor. In this bleak time, a new social order began to take shape, one less dependent on imperial might and more rooted in local survival and cooperation. By the 550s, Justinian's empire limped forward. He had survived both the darkness and the plague, but his realm was exhausted. The Gothic wars in Italy dragged on. The great projects of conquest and reconstruction slowed. The emperor's chroniclers still wrote of glory, but their words were haunted by loss. The mosaic faces in Ravenna's churches gleamed with gold, yet behind them lay a civilization that had barely escaped collapse. Modern scientists believe the source of the 536 event may have been a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, whose ash spread across the northern hemisphere. Later studies suggest additional eruptions in 540 and 547 deepened the crisis. The planet itself seemed to shudder for over a decade. It would take more than a century for global temperatures to recover fully. Imagine it. You're living in a stone village somewhere in Europe, in the middle of the 6th century. You've survived the dark sky, the hunger, and now the plague. The world feels thin, brittle, like the edge of a candle's flame. Each morning, you step outside and look up, just to be sure the sun is still there. You can't explain why, but you feel smaller now, as though humanity has been reminded of its place beneath forces far greater than itself. And that is perhaps the most haunting legacy of the year 536. Not just the cold, not the plague, not the famine, but the memory it left behind, that civilization is fragile, and that light, once lost, can take a lifetime to return. As the smoke cleared from the skies and the forests began to grow again, a new world quietly emerged from the ashes. The survivors of this forgotten apocalypse didn't know it, but they were laying the foundation for the medieval world to come, a world that remembered the darkness and built its faith, its art, and its order around the need for light. The years following 536 were an age of slow awakening, the long and painful reintroduction of the sun to a wounded world. For those who lived through it, the return of light was not cause for celebration, but disbelief. Old men and women would still look to the sky each dawn, half expecting the gray veil to descend again. The memory of darkness had taken root not just in their minds, but in their faith, in their customs, and even in the way they spoke about time itself. People began marking years, not by kings or emperors, but by survival. The year after the darkness, the third summer of warmth. In Constantinople, chroniclers struggled to describe what had happened. Some spoke of ash, others called it divine smoke. There were debates among scholars about whether the heavens themselves had cracked open. The imperial court, weary of calamity, tried to restore order through symbolism. The Hagia Sophia, still glistening from its recent completion, became the empire's most sacred refuge. Justinian ordered daily prayers, and candles were lit across the city, not merely as devotion, but as a way to reclaim light itself. But beneath these gestures, an invisible transformation was unfolding. The Byzantine state, so dependent on the flow of goods and taxes from its provinces, began to shrink inward. In the dusty archives of Egypt and Syria, tax receipts vanished for entire years. Records show abandoned farmlands, lost villages, and desperate petitions from peasants asking for relief from debts they could no longer pay. Grain shipments to Constantinople declined sharply, forcing bread rations to be cut. In some regions, bread was mixed with crushed beans or sawdust to make it last longer. Hunger had reshaped the empire's diet, and in these same years, the plague continued to stalk the population. It was not constant. It ebbed and flowed like a tide, but each return was deadlier. Entire households disappeared in a single week. Streets were cleared by men with vinegar-soaked cloths tied around their faces. Burial pits expanded beyond the city walls. Chroniclers, like Procopius, writing from within the empire, described corpses piled like merchandise in open markets. The emperor's ministers struggled to maintain order, but even the machinery of bureaucracy began to falter. In the far west, the chaos was no less profound. In the ruins of what had once been the Western Roman Empire, small kingdoms fought for survival amid famine and shifting power. The Franks in Gaul, the Lombards in northern Italy, and the Visigoths in Spain all faced the same invisible enemy. the cold, and the scarcity it brought. Some kings resorted to extreme measures, hoarding grain, seizing church lands, or imposing new taxes. Yet others, in a surprising turn, began to rely more on local priests. The church, once merely a spiritual refuge, became a center of social survival. Monasteries grew in importance. Within their stone walls, monks cultivated hardy crops, brewed medicinal tonics, and copied the few surviving manuscripts of ancient learning. In a time when empires crumbled, these quiet enclaves preserved fragments of order. The Benedictine rule, which emphasized discipline, labor, and stability, spread during these very years, a reaction to the chaos that surrounded them. It was as if the world, sensing its fragility, was trying to rebuild itself on the foundation of routine. Far to the north, the darkness took a different form. Archaeological excavations in Scandinavia have revealed a sudden collapse in population during the late 6th century. Entire farms were abandoned. Burial sites show signs of malnutrition. In some areas, ritual deposits, weapons, jewelry, and even animals were thrown into lakes, perhaps as offerings to the gods to bring back the sun. The mythology that would later form the backbone of Norse legend, tales of endless winter and the death of the gods, may have been born in these desperate years. The real world had become indistinguishable from myth. Even as far away as the Americas, there are traces of disruption. Ice cores from Greenland and sediment samples from Peru reveal chemical fingerprints matching the same volcanic events of 536 and 540 in Central America. Several Maya cities appear to have faced crop failures and partial abandonment during this period. It was as though the planet itself, in one shared shiver, had momentarily paused the rhythm of civilizations. By the 540s, the Mediterranean world was struggling toward recovery. But it was a different world altogether. The imperial roads were cracked and overgrown. Many bridges had collapsed, unrepaired. Markets reopened, but trade was smaller, local, and cautious. Gold coins became rare. Barter returned to prominence. In some towns, glassmaking and fine pottery disappeared altogether for decades. The grandeur of Roman craftsmanship was fading into memory. Yet out of this decay came something paradoxically new, the beginning of a medieval identity. Communities that once relied on imperial protection began to rely instead on each other. Local lords fortified villages, not out of ambition, but necessity. Peasants found safety behind walls they helped build, and in exchange they pledged service. This mutual dependence, born of fear, slowly evolved into the system we now call feudalism. What history remembers as the Middle Ages was, in truth, the long echo of 536, a society built in the shadow of catastrophe. And though centuries would pass, the scars of that time endured. Medieval chronicles, written hundreds of years later, still referred to the time of dust when the sun failed. Even the language of apocalypse, of a world turned dark by divine wrath, was shaped by the memory of this era. The fear of a silent sky became embedded in religious art, in sermons, and in prophecy. When later generations spoke of the end of days, they were, unknowingly, remembering 536, as science has revealed. It was likely not a single eruption, but a chain of them. Iceland, then perhaps El Salvador or Indonesia, that plunged the planet into darkness. The ash and sulfur, suspended in the stratosphere, scattered sunlight and lowered temperatures. Crops failed from Ireland to China. The very air that people breathed carried the fingerprints of disaster. Modern climatologists estimate that global temperatures dropped by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius, enough to ruin harvests and spark famines across continents. Imagine what that must have felt like for those living in wooden huts or crumbling Roman villas. One day the sun shines normally. The next it is as if twilight never ends. You go to sleep under a gray sky, and months later it still has not cleared. Livestock die, not from disease, but from starvation. Children grow thin, rivers freeze early. Even the birds migrate too soon, leaving the skies eerily silent. The world becomes smaller, quieter, not by choice, but by exhaustion. And through it all, people adapted, slowly, painfully, but relentlessly. In the ash-darkened fields of Europe, the first resilient rye and oats were planted. In Byzantine cities, new medical practices emerged, the first attempts at quarantine, the beginnings of public health. In monasteries, candle making improved. Wax and tallow became precious, symbols of hope against the night. Humanity was learning, through suffering, how to survive a world that could turn against it without warning. In the years that followed, humanity did not simply endure, it transformed. After 536, every sunrise was seen as both a blessing and a warning. People had learned that the sky could betray them, that the sun could vanish without reason. This realization altered how entire cultures viewed the divine. The gods, it seemed, were not only powerful, they were unpredictable, capable of snatching away life and light in a heartbeat. Priests, oracles, and prophets gained new authority, for the world desperately wanted answers that science could not yet provide. In the eastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire, reports circulated of blood-red suns that lingered like omens in the haze. In Alexandria, scholars debated whether this was the fulfillment of the Book of Revelation. Some Christians believed the Last Judgment had begun, while others saw it as proof that mankind's sins had provoked divine anger. Pagan shrines, long forbidden, were secretly visited once more. Offerings of oil, flowers, and sometimes animals appeared at the bases of forgotten statues. When the world seemed to unravel, old faiths resurfaced like ghosts. In Rome, a city still haunted by its imperial past, the darkness gave birth to new superstitions. People whispered that the shades of dead emperors were walking through the Forum, reclaiming the empire that humans had failed to preserve. Churches filled with the scent of incense and fear. The priests spoke of penance, fasting, and the cleansing fire of prayer. But outside those holy walls, people simply wanted bread, or at least hope that the next harvest would not fail as the last had. By 540, the famine had reached even the lands that had once been lush and fertile. The Nile's floodwaters ran lower than usual. The Black Sea froze at its edges. Chroniclers in Ireland wrote that a failure of bread had struck the island, while in China, the Northern Wei dynasty faced crop collapses and social unrest. From one end of Eurasia to the other, humanity was united in its suffering. It was perhaps the first time the entire known world shared a single catastrophe, even if they could not yet comprehend it. But amid the despair, certain places began to adapt with surprising resilience. In the small coastal villages of the Mediterranean, people turned to the sea for sustenance. Fishing, once a humble occupation, became a lifeline. Salted fish, seaweed, and even shellfish entered diets that had long relied on wheat. In the mountains, shepherds survived by moving their herds to the few valleys that still held warmth. And in cities, traders began bartering candles, dried fruit, and old grain as though they were treasures. Archaeologists today find evidence of this shift. Granaries hastily converted into living quarters. Hearths rebuilt with improvised chimneys to trap every ounce of warmth. And simple clay oil lamps found in abundance across Europe and the Near East. People had learned to live with less light, both literally and metaphorically. Their architecture, tools, and diets became smaller, humbler, and more cautious. Humanity was entering a new phase, not of triumph, but of endurance. As the 6th century wore on, new generations were born who had never known a bright sky. To them, the gray world was normal. They played in ashen fields and learned to read by candlelight. In these dim years, storytellers became vital. Around village fires and monastery hearths, people told tales of the old world, of cities gleaming with marble, of endless feasts, of summers that once smelled of wheat and honey. These stories preserved memory, but also identity. They reminded people that they came from greatness, even if their present was shadowed by ruin. Interestingly, it was during this very period that legends of a lost golden age began to take shape. In Northern Europe, poets began singing of vanished sunlight and sleeping kings who would return when the land healed. The seeds of the Arthurian legends, though centuries from their mature form, may have been sown in this darkness, a yearning for light personified in a hero who would restore the land. In Scandinavia, the myth of Fimbulwinter, the endless winter before the world's end, likely took root in these cold decades. These were not just stories. They were cultural memories wrapped in myth. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine East, a different kind of transformation was occurring. The empire's wealthiest citizens began retreating from cities to rural estates, seeking self-sufficiency. Great villas were converted into fortified manors. The concept of private protection, of loyalty in exchange for security, began taking hold. From these arrangements would later emerge the first outlines of feudalism, a system born not from greed, but from the need to survive in a fractured world. Even trade, once the empire's lifeblood, changed its character. Silk and spices still arrived from the east, but in smaller, riskier convoys. Instead of gold, merchants accepted iron tools, livestock, or cloth. The idea of a money economy faded for a time. When silver coins were found decades later, buried in the ruins of cities like Antioch or Carthage, they were often hoarded, not spent. The world had become a place of preservation, not ambition. But just as the world seemed trapped in perpetual shadow, small signs of recovery began to appear. Around 547, records show that the Mediterranean skies began to clear. The sun's warmth returned gradually, the harvests improved, and birdsong came back to the mornings. It must have felt like rebirth, cautious, fragile, and uncertain. Farmers, who had nearly given up, began sowing seeds again. Wheat and barley returned to the fields. Life crept back into the soil. Yet the memory of darkness did not fade easily. Entire generations had grown up, fearing the sky. Festivals were held not merely to celebrate the sun's return, but to appease it. Offerings of fruit, wine, and lighted candles were made each year to thank the heavens for the day. These rituals would blend into later medieval customs and harvest festivals. What had begun as desperation became tradition, and tradition became culture. It is difficult, even now, to grasp the psychological weight of those years. Imagine a lifetime defined by uncertainty, when each dawn might be your last, when food might not last the week, when the very air felt cold with death. People didn't just survive physically. They rebuilt meaning itself. Every church bell that rang, every seed planted, every newborn child represented defiance against the memory of 536. Humanity, for all its fragility, had proven something extraordinary. It could adapt even to the absence of the sun. And in the end, the world that emerged from this ordeal was not the same one that entered it. The old Roman world, with its luxury, order, and monumental pride, had been broken. But in its place grew the roots of something humbler, yet enduring, the early medieval world. Its people valued resilience over grandeur, faith over empire, and community over conquest. The Age of Darkness, as modern historians sometimes call it, was not only an age of suffering, it was also the crucible from which the Middle Ages were forged. When future generations gazed at the ruins of Rome, they saw not just decay, but lessons written in stone. They understood that even the mightiest empires could crumble overnight, that survival was not guaranteed, that humility before nature was wisdom, not weakness. And though they lacked the language of modern science, they grasped a timeless truth that the earth itself is alive, capable of both creation and destruction. The world had changed forever. And while the sun eventually returned, humanity would never look at it the same way again. When the darkness finally lifted, it was not with a fanfare, but with a slow exhale. The sun returned to its familiar throne in the sky, yet everything looked changed. Fields still lay bald, ancient roads filled with dust, and the fine lattice of trade that once knitted together empires had grown fragile and thin. What had begun as a year of catastrophe had ended as a century of transformation. In the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, the emperor's hopes of restoring Roman glory remained, yet his world had shifted beneath him. The money that once funded armies now went to feed the hungry. The taxes that once built aqueducts struggled to maintain city walls. The empire's dignity remained, but its foundations had become modest. Justinian's basilicas gleamed, yet the empire outside its gates contracted. The dream of a universal empire became a quieter hope. Across Europe, the shaking of nature's calendar brought new ways of living. As long-distance trade faltered and central governments weakened, local power became stronger. In villages where merchants once passed, lords offered protection. In return, peasants provided service. The old Roman estates broke into manors. The local churches took on roles of charity and administration. What historians later called the medieval world had quietly begun here, born not from chivalry or knights, but from survival and community. In monasteries, the struggle for light and life took a different form. The very act of copying a manuscript, of preserving a page of wisdom while the sky was dim, became an act of defiance. The Benedictine rule spread, teaching that stability, obedience, and work were the anchors when everything else floated away. Those stone cloisters became living testaments that culture did not have to vanish when empires faltered. They held books, seeds, tools, memory. Meanwhile, the echo of 536 lived in myth. In northern Europe, the old texts spoke of Fimbulvitr, 3 winters, the sun silent, the world collapsing. The Vikings would later tell it as prophecy. In Ireland, the annals of failure of bread became part of the collective memory of famine. In China, historians recorded yellow dust, rain, and cold summers. Across languages and lands, the catastrophe was reshaped into story, ritual, legend. Nature's wrath was folded into human meaning. Yet the most profound legacy may be in what the world did not do. For centuries, humans believed the sun would return automatically. After 536, that belief was shaken. People planted less land, stored more food, built stronger granaries, and asked prayers before harvest. The rhythm of the seasons was no longer assumed. To survive one dark year was extraordinary. To know it could happen again changed how people lived. In the east of the empire, the plague of Justinian marked another chapter in this long story. As people wasted away, governments receded. Soldiers could not march. Monuments could not rise. Economies sputtered. The old world of Rome, built on wealth and scale, began fading. The new world would be smaller, local, slower, but ironically more resilient in the face of nature's unpredictability. In the forests of Scandinavia, archaeologists find empty farms, a drop in coinage, hoards buried under cold ground. The silver that once filled Roman coffers stopped circulating. The wealthy hid their wealth in the earth. The collapse of the old economy was not only physical but symbolic. The world that emerged was different, not less human, but limited, simpler, sharpened by necessity. For you listening now, perhaps in a warm room lit by electricity, it's hard to feel what that meant. No one worried that the sun would vanish or the crops fail because they were seasoned. But for the people of the 6th century, every dawn was a gift, every harvest a gamble. Their survival depended on that delicate balance between light and earth, between sun and soil. In 536, the balance tipped, and though the sun came back, the world never forgot. The year 536 was not simply the worst year to be alive. It was the hinge on which the ancient world pivoted into the medieval. It taught humanity that survival was not guaranteed, that nature could not always be tamed, and that societies must build not only greatness but endurance. So now, as the story drifts to its close and you settle deeper into sleep, imagine the pale sunrise of 536 forming shadows on empty fields. Think of the fires burning late into the night, of monks writing by faint candlelight, of children who grew up never knowing clear summer skies. Let their survival be a whisper in your thoughts, a reminder of what humankind overcame and what it built in the quiet aftermath of darkness. As the smoke of centuries drifted away, the faint light of recovery began to flicker. It was not sudden nor glorious. It came slowly, like embers glowing under ash. Farmers returned to the fields that had long lain barren, their plows sinking into exhausted soil. The first harvests were thin, but they carried a deeper meaning than sustenance. They were proof that the world had not ended after all. In the heartlands of Europe, settlements that had emptied during the Great Famine began to breathe again. The forests, which had reclaimed villages during the years of darkness, were now being cleared anew. Charcoal burners, woodcutters, and ironworkers appeared again in the valleys. It was the sound of civilization rebuilding itself, cautious, humble, but determined. The memory of catastrophe shaped their every move. They planted more variety of crops, learned to store food, and built their homes sturdier. The climate, though slowly improving, remained unpredictable. Some summers were still cool, others wet beyond measure. The air carried a faint melancholy, as though the earth itself had not yet recovered from its long fever. And yet humanity adapted. Where wheat once failed, rye and barley thrived. Where orchards had withered, peasants began raising hardy livestock instead. The ingenuity of survival turned desperation into innovation. In the Byzantine East, scholars and theologians began searching for meaning in the disaster that had nearly undone them. Chroniclers, like Procopius, recorded the sun's dimness, not as myth, but as observation, trying to make sense of a natural calamity that had no precedent in living memory. Others interpreted it as divine punishment, a call for repentance. Churches filled with the frightened and the faithful alike, and hymns of forgiveness echoed through the marble halls of Constantinople. At the same time, in far-off lands, entire cultures were shifting. In Mesoamerica, the Maya cities began showing signs of stress. Droughts and failed harvests coincided with population decline. In Asia, the Great Silk Road quieted traders spoke of endless winter and dying camels in the high passes. The once thriving arteries of exchange that linked East and West fell silent. The world had contracted, not by war, but by cold and hunger. The historians of later ages would look back and see in this age of gloom a strange paradox. Out of ruin came resilience. Communities that survived the mid-6th century catastrophe emerged harder, wiser, and more connected to the rhythms of the earth. The Roman ideals of progress and conquest gave way to a humbler philosophy that endurance itself was a form of greatness. Art, too, changed. The mosaics of the post-Justinian world grew darker in tone. The gleam of gold tesserae still shone, but the eyes of saints seemed more sorrowful. The art of light had learned the language of shadow. In northern Europe, the old pagan carvings of the sun and stars gave way to Christian crosses entwined with runic knots, as if the people were trying to weave the old world and the new into one fabric of meaning. Trade began to creep back along the Mediterranean, carried by merchants who remembered the roots of their grandfathers. But instead of silks and perfumes, they now carried grain and salt, the true gold of a scarred generation. Markets reopened, cities repopulated, and the pulse of life returned. Yet beneath it all lay a quiet wisdom that no empire, no wealth, no power could ever outshine the mercy of sunlight. The great forests of northern Europe, once thick with silence, began to echo again with human sound, the ringing of bells, the creak of wooden carts, the laughter of children chasing one another along thawed rivers. It was the return of ordinary life, the greatest miracle of all. To live again, to work the soil, to see dawn after centuries of uncertainty that was redemption enough. Monks continued to write, but their scripts grew steadier now. Their parchment no longer trembled in cold candlelight, and their ink no longer froze in the inkwell. They wrote not only prayers, but chronicles, memories of the dark years, warnings for those who would come after. One monk wrote simply, "The sun returned, and so did hope." In the east, traders from Persia and India began to stir again. The ports of the Red Sea filled with sails. Caravans once more traversed the deserts. Civilization, like a wounded beast, had found its feet. The global network that had fractured was stitching itself back together, thread by thread, road by road, heart by heart. And yet, even as the light returned, something intangible lingered, a humility before nature. The people of the 6th and 7th centuries became the keepers of a lesson that modern humanity too often forgets, that the world is not ours to command. Every sunrise is borrowed, every harvest a fragile gift. By the late 6th century, the crisis had faded into memory, but its legacy endured in every monastery's discipline, every farmer's caution, and every child's prayer for sunlight. Out of one of history's darkest chapters emerged a new kind of civilization, one built not on empire or wealth, but on faith, endurance, and the quiet courage to begin again. As the century advanced, the echoes of the catastrophe still murmured beneath the foundations of new societies. Entire generations had grown up beneath gray skies, and their worldview was marked by caution, a deep sense that life was fragile and owed to forces beyond comprehension. From this shared trauma, a new social order began to form. In Europe, as the remnants of the Western Roman world finally dissolved, local lords and village elders emerged as protectors of their isolated communities. Where once emperors ruled vast domains, now smaller circles of power defined human existence. Out of this fragmentation, the seeds of the medieval kingdoms were sown. Survival depended not on imperial decrees, but on cooperation. Peasants, warriors, monks, and craftsmen, all bound by necessity rather than ambition. The world had grown smaller, yet closer. The church, which had been one of the few institutions to endure the long winter, now became the moral spine of a wounded continent. Its monasteries, once refuges from chaos, transformed into centers of knowledge and healing. Monks cultivated hardy crops, copied surviving manuscripts, and offered shelter to travelers along the new, uncertain roads. Without realizing it, they were preserving the embers of civilization. Even the concept of kingship was reshaped by the darkness. The rulers who arose in the post-536 world, the Merovingians in Gaul, the Lombards in Italy, and the early Anglo-Saxon leaders in Britain, understood that legitimacy came not from divine right alone, but from the ability to safeguard people through famine and storm. Power now meant protection. Leadership was measured not in gold, but in grain. The scars of that bleak age, however, left traces in the collective imagination. Myths of sunless skies and fire-breathing mountains entered folklore. Norse legends spoke of Fimbulwinter, the great winter before the end of the world. Celtic stories told of veiled suns and gods who slept beneath the earth. Even centuries later, when the skies had long cleared, the memory of 536 lingered in songs, superstitions, and holy rituals that sought to keep the light alive. Farther east, in China, court historians of the Northern Wei and Liang dynasties recorded the dust veil that dimmed the heavens, linking it to omens of dynastic change. Empires rose and fell in synchrony with the rhythms of climate, a pattern invisible to them, yet clear to modern historians. The catastrophe of 536 AD had not merely frozen crops. It had subtly rewritten the destinies of nations. By the early 7th century, as warmth returned and harvests improved, humanity had adapted to its new limits. Watermills, new plowing methods, and hardier breeds of grain spread across Europe and Asia. These were not the inventions of luxury, but of necessity. From famine grew innovation, from despair resilience. And so, when later historians called 536 the worst year to be alive, they were only half right. It was indeed a year of unimaginable suffering, but also the beginning of a transformation. The men and women who endured that twilight became the bridge between the ancient and the medieval worlds. They did not know it, but their endurance was laying the groundwork for the age of cathedrals, chivalry, and learning that would someday follow. As dawn finally brightened over the world, a truth older than any empire had been reaffirmed. Humanity survives not because it conquers the earth, but because it learns to live with it. The sun that once vanished had returned, and with it the promise that even in the darkest century, light never truly dies. When you gently close your eyes tonight, allow your mind to drift back to the year 536 CE, a year when the sun dimmed, crops failed, empires trembled, and yet humanity endured. Think of the farmers who planted seeds that never sprouted, the monks who copied manuscripts by candlelight under a pale sky, the children who grew up never knowing a summer that felt warm. As the light returned, the world had changed. New societies emerged from the ashes of the old, built not on power and empire, but on community, resilience, and quiet faith. The year that once seemed the worst to be alive became the threshold into a new age. So when you rise tomorrow, grateful for the brightness of day, remember, every sunrise is borrowed, every harvest a triumph. The scars of 536 still speak, not just of darkness, but of endurance. And that endurance is yours too. Thank you for traveling back in time with me. Let the memory of those who lived through the dimmed sun rest gently as you drift into sleep, and know that even when light seems lost, hope remains.